Hello Summoners, my name is John and this is episode 2 of League Learning. I'm calling it Player Positions. In this episode we're going to be talking about the various roles that different players and champions can take on the fields of battle and where they fit into a typical team composition. Now if you haven't watched episode 1, please go back and do so. I'm going to include a link right down here or somewhere in this area. You'll see it somewhere on the screen later when I add it in editing. But if you haven't seen it, you need to go back because I'm going to be using some terminology that you may be unfamiliar with. Now, if you're already familiar with League terminology, by all means, please just continue watching the episode. If not, go back and I get to introduce you to some League terminology that is fairly important to the beginning player. Now, the first thing we have to talk about is the sliding scale of damage versus survivability, and this is simply a concept that because you only have 6 item slots as a champion, you can only build certain amounts of each of survivability and damage. And because items typically have a lot of one and none of the other, or a lot of one and none of the other, or something that's sort of in the middle, you have a sort of scale where you have damage on this side and you have survivability on this side, and champions sort of fall somewhere on this scale in general. Now, I'm going to be talking about general categories rather than specific champions, but I'll list some examples of champions that fit into categories. So, when you're buying items, you have to balance what you want, damage versus survivability. And your role on the team and your champion that you choose partially dictate which items you're going to buy. So, that's what I'm here to explain. And the first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about tanks, which fall all the way over here on the damage versus survivability scale. So what you have is tanks. What makes a tank? A tank has high health, high defensive stats, magic resistance, and armor, and typically some form of initiation or crowd control. And a tank, their job is to absorb damage so that the rest of their team doesn't. They start a team fight, which is when you have 5 players versus 5 players, and they all get together and fight. That's called a team fight, and I should have covered that in a different episode. But they start the team fights. They are the ones who initiate. And then finally, once the team fight has initiated, they are charged with disabling crucial enemy targets, namely the carry, sometimes the support, or the caster. And to give you some examples of tanks, we have AP-based tanks. We have, for example, Singed is an AP-based tank. Amumu, Nautilus, these are AP-based tanks. Strict health tanks, Dr. Moonbill, Shen, they're very tanky and they scale very well on health and mostly health alone rather than including defensive stats. And then finally we have armor and magic resistance tanks. For example, Ramus scales, he gets more attack damage based on how much armor he has. So he builds a lot of armor. And Galio is exactly the same, but he gains more AP for how much magic resist he's got. So they're tanky, but they sort of specialize in one defensive stat. On the other hand, on the other side of the sliding scale from tanks are the carries. The carries are over here, and they do a lot of damage, but have not really a whole lot of survivability. So what makes a carry? A carry has high attack damage, has some sort of range on their auto attack. I mean, you're not going to find a melee AD carry typically. There are some, and they'll be covered maybe later. Thirdly, they have a self-increasing ability of some stat, which is called a steroid. For example, they may increase their own attack speed, they may increase their own attack damage, they may increase, they may have a special ability that does damage, that does more damage every now and again. And finally, they have an escape, some sort of ability that allows them to move away from danger and get out of a sticky situation so that they can continue to do damage instead of just being focused down and killed immediately, because they don't really have a whole lot of survivability. So the job of a carry is to sit in the back of the team fight and to deal absurd amounts of damage over the course of a team fight via right-clicking. And that's all a built AD carry really has to do, is right-click. And when they right-click, people die. And they die very quickly. Some examples of carries. Caitlyn, Ashe, Tristana, Kog'Maw, Vayne, Graves, Draven. All of these are carries, and they're not by any means the only carries, but they're some of the more popular ones. And in my opinion, they're one of the ones that sort of stick in my mind. Again, if they meet the 4 criteria, they have high attack damage, they have range, they have some sort of steroid, and they have an escape, then they can pretty much qualify as a carry. So, you know. On the other hand, you have tanks, you have carries, and then sort of somewhere over here, but outside of the typical range, is a caster. And now what makes a caster is they do a lot of damage, but unlike a carry, they do their damage primarily through abilities. They'll have the abilities will do good damage, typically front-loaded damage, initial damage as you may call it, and they also typically have good scaling on their abilities, as in more attack damage will increase the damage of their ability more than some other champions, or the ability power will increase their damage more than some other champions. And they typically have some sort of escape or crowd control so that they can also get out of sticky situations or disable crucial targets. So what does a caster do? A caster in a team fight is supposed to sort of move in and out. They move in and unload all of their spells on targets of opportunity. And then they do a lot of damage very quickly, which we call burst damage. And then they back off. And they wait for their spells to come off of cooldown. And once they do that, they go right back into the fight and they unload again. So a caster does a lot of initial damage, and they're very good for front-loading the damage in a team fight. But long story short, they're not terribly reliable on the long term when it comes to damage. So casters are a good source of damage, but again, in a team fight, your AD carry is going to be your primary source of damage. So some examples of casters, for example, Ezreal, Corki, Kog'Maw, and Varus are all actually, I would qualify, AD casters. Now, a lot of people consider them carries, but the thing is, they're sort of a hybrid in that they do a lot of damage through their auto attacks, and they build a lot of AD items because their abilities primarily scale on AD. But the difference between them and a typical AD carry is that they do their damage primarily through their abilities and their synergy between their abilities and their auto attacks. So, on the other hand, we have AP casters. We have Morgana, Annie, Swain, Ryze, Vladimir, Cassiopeia, Fiddlesticks. There are so many casters in the game. It's kind of ridiculous. And I really like casters because I feel like they always got something going on. That's not really the point here. But if a character has good damaging abilities, good scaling on said abilities, and some sort of crowd control or escape, then they can be considered a caster. So, if their champion fits those three criteria, then you can probably consider them a caster. Another good indication is if Riot classifies them as a mage, that would make them into a caster. Next, we have to talk about bruisers.